Good morning. I'd like to invite you to have a cup of tea with me this morning and talk about a few ideas related to that. So I have a question for you. Are you a sponge? Or are you a tea bag? You know, a sponge is interesting. It soaks up the water that it's around, and the water just becomes a part of the sponge. If we think of water as the culture or the world around us, we definitely don't want to be like that sponge, soaking up the things that are around us. Right now, our culture is full of some negative things, fear and anxiety, uncertainty, even anger and frustration. And the Bible has some guidelines for us about controlling those emotions and those attitudes and those thoughts. In Romans 12:2, it says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. 2 Corinthians 10:5 says, casting down imaginations that are high and mighty against God, but bringing into captivity every thought to Christ. And of course, in Philippians 4:8, we have that famous passage about whatever things are honest, just, pure, lovely, of good report, if they have virtue or they're praiseworthy, to think on these things. And so soaking up that culture around us is not a good thing. It's kind of like the talk that Mark gave us last week about perspective, having that correct perspective, God's perspective, and not the world's perspective. Well, on the other hand, a tea bag in water, when you think about it, the tea bag changes the water that it is exposed to. And that also is a scriptural principle. In Acts 17:6, it talks about the disciples who had turned the world upside down. In the Old Testament, in Esther chapter 4, we have that famous passage about Esther coming to the kingdom for such a time as this. Pastor Dan brought that out last week, that we are placed in this time, in this place, and it's for a purpose, for such a time as this. Matthew 5:16, Jesus tells us to let your light shine before men so that they may see your Father in heaven and glorify him. And then even in 1 Thessalonians, when Paul is speaking to the believers who are distraught over some of their loved ones and fellow believers who had died, and he said, no, we do not grieve as others who have no hope, but we know that life is more than this present world that we can see. And so even if the worst happens and death comes, even that is not an occasion for us to despair or be fearful or anxious, because we know that the Lord has all things in his control. So I want to go back to my question. Are you a sponge or are you a tea bag? Be the change that you want to see. And so God bless you this week as you are a tea bag for him.